Hi, my name is Robert Edwards. As I mentioned in my email, you can go ahead and call me Bobby if you want. So I'm going to begin with this first lecture with a little bit of historical background for the scholarship that we're doing in this class. So I want to begin with a discussion about why this course exists and why we are all here now to learn about the field of American Indian history. More specifically, I want to talk about the politics of the things we are learning here, so you go into the readings and the assignments with a heightened awareness of why the subject is important, both inside and outside of the classroom. I'll begin with a brief introduction to the field of American Indian Studies. Unlike most traditional academic subjects, the field of American Indian Studies developed from a series of social and political movements linked to the politics of indigenous peoples and tribal nations. To appreciate this political dimension of the field, we first need to get a basic understanding of the issues that have driven American Indian social and political movements. This brings our attention to the history of European empires in the Americas. The imperial histories of Spain, Portugal, England, and France are part of this story. In this course, however, we are focused on the modern era in North America, so the main thing to pay attention to is how United States empire and U.S. settler colonialism have impacted American Indians. There are a lot of issues to unpack here, which we will take up in the coming weeks. For now, I'll just highlight what should be obvious to us all already, which is that the North American continent is indigenous land that indigenous societies have lived on since time immemorial. The history of European empires in North America has been a violent one, with repeating cycles of genocide, occupation, displacement, and exploitation. And despite this history of oppression and dispossession, Native peoples and tribal nations have resisted and endured as modern peoples with layered and complex relationships to the U.S. nation-state. And their social, cultural, and political presence continues to shape the world and its future. These are the basic issues that have driven American Indian social and political movements. Thus, as an academic field, the purpose of American Indian Studies is to shed light on these issues. Let me provide a historical example connecting American Indian social and political history to academic scholarship. With intellectual roots in indigenous cultural traditions and in the anti-colonial critiques made by tribal leaders, American Indian scholarship took a more academic tone in the 1910s, when the Society of American Indians was formed. Organized by middle-class indigenous intellectuals who had been educated in American institutions, the group wrote and published important social commentaries that brought Native perspectives to a wider public audience. Although they had divided opinions about things like U.S. law and policy, the group's members played an important role in theorizing Native American issues. After the Society of American Indians, later generations of indigenous scholars and activists articulated their own ideas in the public sphere. In doing so, they provided valuable insights into the issues affecting Native peoples in the modern era. They also highlighted Native American contributions to U.S. culture and global culture. Altogether, the important thing to understand here is that the field of American Indian Studies was rooted in American Indian activism and scholarship. This course is also influenced by the academic field of ethnic studies. In the late 1960s, a student movement at California colleges led to the creation of ethnic studies. The student coalition included African American, Mexican American, American Indian, and Asian American students. The student coalition was inspired by the Civil Rights Movement, the Black Power movement, and by anti-colonial movements that were then unfolding around the world at that time. The Student Coalition openly criticized the social inequality on college campuses, and they connected that inequality to larger histories of racism, capitalism, and imperialism. The students demanded new initiatives that would ensure more equity, diversity, and inclusion on college campuses. They also demanded a fresh curriculum that would speak to their diverse historical and cultural experiences. Altogether, they wanted an alternative to the Eurocentric and white-centric knowledge that was typically taught on college campuses. This was the origin of ethnic studies as an academic discipline. Since the 1970s, the fields of American Indian Studies and ethnic studies have developed in close dialogue. They stand out among the academic disciplines insofar as they represent the critical voice of people who have been marginalized by the academy. Allies also play an important role in the critical scholarship of these fields. I myself am a white academic working in both fields, and I do so with a reflexive understanding of my own place in the histories I have described here. And inevitably, there will be a diverse group of students enrolled in American Indian Studies and in Ethnic Studies courses. And that's a good thing. Everyone has a stake in what we have to learn here. We all need a better understanding of our world and our place in it before we can think critically and act ethically. Now I'm going to transition into the field of American Indian history. So, in the process of doing that, I first need to do an overview of the discipline of history itself. History is one of the older, more established academic disciplines. In a nutshell, the disciplinary agenda is to study the past. One core issue historians work on is how to organize the past using chronology and periodization. This is to segment time into different centuries, for example, or to give terminology to different periods. Another issue we focus on is called historicism. This means understanding the past on its own terms. The past was a different world with different ideas, different technology, different cultures, etc. And so as historians, we need to grapple with that. To make sense of history, historians use the narrative form. Although historical research has a scientific method to it, the writing of history is all about storytelling. And then through these processes, historians try to interpret the meaning of events, make sense of change over time, that is, how and why things happened in a particular way. And finally, historians try to make sense of the present as well. We can never really truly understand the world today without understanding how we got here. This brings us to a more technical term, which is historiography. The term historiography is a fancy word used to describe the theories and methods that historians use. The word also refers to the intellectual history of the discipline and the scholarly debates that have taken place. The term historiography is important to mention here because it highlights the interpretive element of history writing. In other words, when we read history books, we are reading a historian's attempted reconstruction of the past. But the past can be interpreted in different ways depending on what the historian is focused on. This means that the meaning of events is always up for debate. The best thing that historians can do is use evidence and argumentation to push for a more accurate representation of past events. The heart of the problem is the narrative form. If history is storytelling, whose story is being focused on? Whose story is not being recognized? And what are the implications of all this? Thus, there is a politics to historiography. There is a diversity of historical viewpoints, and our understanding of the past is shaped by which viewpoint we take. This is not an equal fight. Our understanding of the past is often skewed because history is often written from the perspective of people in power. Powerful institutions use historical narratives to legitimate the systems of oppression and equality that keep them in power. One example of this is Eurocentric history. This is global history written from the perspective of Europeans. This kind of history takes things like European empire for granted as natural and inevitable processes of history. This is clearly a one-sided distortion of history that ignores the experiences of the non-European world. Another example of distorted historical narrative is nationalist histories. These kinds of histories might be written by any country in any part of the world. One feature of this style of history is to put the ideals and the destiny of that nation above all others. Nationalist histories tend to erase parts of the past that reflect negatively on the nation. At the same time, they exaggerate parts of the past that reflect positively on the nation. This creates a distorted mythology for that nation that is essentially a form of propaganda. Governments make this style of history mandatory in their public education systems to create patriotism among their citizens. There may be affirming or affirmative aspects to this kind of history, like national pride, for example. But overall, these types of history writing don't present a well-rounded picture of things. It can also create harmful biases and prejudices. These kinds of nationalist biases can help fuel wars and other historical problems. To challenge these dangerous forms of historical writing, critical historians use evidence and argumentation to show a more balanced picture of the past. Part of this work has to do with historical representation. History can be improved if we recognize the histories of marginalized peoples. The impact of critical history is that it expands our historical consciousness. In turn, this expands our political consciousness as well. Altogether, critical history has a positive impact on today's society, and it is crucial for creating a more equitable and just future. Let me unpack the myths of American history to give us a start. We want to be aware of ideologies such as ethno-nationalism, which is a Eurocentric view of history, kind of like the ones I described. This also includes the ideology of white supremacy. American history also has something in it called American exceptionalism. And so this is the old city on a hill narrative that you may have heard of in grade school. This is the story of when the Pilgrims were fleeing from England and sailed on the Mayflower and landed on Plymouth Rock. And from there, this story of kind of a religious destiny was planned for the continent. And this is, of course, a very limited, one-sided view of the meaning of American history. Another related theme is the American experiment. And so through this process of American democracy, the morality of American democracy is presented in a way that erases all the negative stuff that happened on the way there. The genocides, the land theft, and what have you, are kind of brushed under the rug, so we can celebrate this idea of this unique heritage of American history. And that being the 4th of July coming around the corner, is maybe something to think about. Another issue is manifest destiny, which is similar to the city on a hill narrative. It's the idea that the American nation state is a Christian promised land. This entails the ideal of progress in American civilization. And again, all these images of what American is kind of a distorted picture of what actually really happened in history. And it really limits the meaning of American history to a very small point of view. These ideological themes that are woven into the story of American history also include a number of misrepresentations of American Indian experiences and perspectives. This includes, kind of a representation of the continent as a virgin land, empty of people. The idea of racial hierarchy, again, another way of describing white supremacy. There's a number of stereotypes for American Indians as quote-unquote savages or quote-unquote primitive or quote-unquote uncivilized. And in addition, there's often a one-dimensional portrayal of American Indians as kind of this monolithic group of people, stereotyped people, when in reality there's an incredible amount of diversity in the tribal histories of Native America. And in addition, the American history narrative has a lot of erasure, which I've commented on, but expanding on what I've said, one thing to observe is that American Indians are often presented as being frozen in the pre-modern past. They're described as not being able to, go along with progress and cultural change. They belong to the past in order for Europeans to occupy the present and the future. And as long as that order is stabilized in the American narrative, that kind of helps justify and rationalize the occupation of the continent. And so one of the effects of this is that American Indians have been made invisible in modern history, in modern U.S. history. They're often rarely acknowledged or made part of the story, because if they were made part of the story, it would throw this entire narrative that I've discussed out of whack. There's a couple concrete examples I can mention in terms of the historiography of U.S. history. Some of these things you may have heard of. Frederick Jackson Turner is an early example of a historian who wrote about American history in a way that misrepresented both the United States and Native America. So Frederick Jackson Turner's 1893 book, The Frontier in American History, that book presented a Eurocentric view of American history. And in this view, the British and the US mainly stood alone on an empty continent. This erased the histories of Native Americans and other European empires, giving a privileged space to the United States. Turner's main argument was that the westward expansion from the East Coast to the West Coast shaped national identity and national character. In this frontier narrative, American Indians were represented as tragic victims of an industrializing society. They were also presented as incompatible with national progress. As such, they were presented as the polar opposite of modern America. Turner's argument coincided with the broader nationalist ideology of manifest destiny. Another person we can refer to in terms of influential historians who shaped a distorted view of U.S. history was Herbert Eugene Bolton. Bolton was actually a student of Frederick Jackson Turner. His 1921 book called The Spanish Borderlands established an alternative vision of the West compared to the Turner thesis. In Bolton's thesis, the history of the Spanish Empire, rather than the U.S., was the driver of history, at least on the western part of the continent. Unlike Turner, Bolton included American Indians in the story. He recognized them as historical actors, but they still played a marginalized role in the larger narrative of European conquest. Yet another kind of history writing came from a school of thought known as ethnohistory. Starting in the 1950s, anthropologists began writing historical studies of American Indian peoples. Ethnohistory gave new attention to American Indian culture in the realm of history, but the discipline of anthropology also had a number of Eurocentric biases, and this historical tradition had its own share of problems. By the 1970s, we get a turn where American Indian historians, in line with the field of American Indian studies, they led the way in challenging these Eurocentric narratives. This marked the beginning of American Indian history as an independent field of scholarship. This form of critical history has emphasized American Indian historical agency, and the key term is on the presentation slide here. I would note that some of the old ideological features of the early historians that gave a distorted image of U.S. history, those problems still exist in U.S. history today. And so it is very much a battle over who gets to define the meaning of American history, or whether the nation-state box that we put that idea in is too limited to understand the real actual history of what happened in the continent of North America in the last few hundred years. And so, again, this highlights the politics of the history writing that continues today. And that's a major component of this class. So to wind this to an end, I want to present an alternative framework for you to think about what we're doing here in this class. What we're doing is reframing the history of North America. We want to decenter the mainstream narrative of U.S. history, and we want to recenter American Indian historical experiences and perspectives. Now, this gives added emphasis to the agency, the voices, and the visions of the future that American Indian peoples had in the time period we'll be discussing here, which is the modern era, 1890 to the end of the 20th century. So again, we can reimagine this in a more critical way. Instead of U.S. history, we can think of this as a history of North America from an indigenous point of view. And so this leads to focus on distinct topics like tribal histories, the histories of the indigenous Americas, which means the North and South American continent as a collective historical experience. We can think about global indigenous political movements because indigenous peoples are not limited to the Americas. And in the last 40 or 50 years, there's been some networking across indigenous groups in different parts of the world who are pushing for similar rights. We can also do new critical analyses of race, ethnicity, gender, class, and sexuality. And American Indian history gives us new perspectives on U.S. empire, American culture, and global capitalism. So these are some of the topics that we'll be discussing in this class. Please have at the readings and do the summaries and the discussion board. And I'll be back next week for a second lecture.